From the moment I bought my house, I knew that the homeowner association didn't like me. Not because I was a bad neighbor, not because my house was a problem, but because I refused to conform to their rules. The community where I lived had those typical neighborhood associations that love to intrude in other people's lives. Excessive fees, illogical rules, policies that changed according to the will of the homeowner. Association president, I didn't sign anything. My house was exempt from their jurisdiction, but that didn't stop them from trying. First, there were the notifications. A bunch of documents inviting me to join the homeowner association, as if it were a great privilege to pay hundreds of dollars a month to be told what color my fence should be. Then the visits began. The president of the homeowner association, a woman who spoke with a sweet tone but had a piercing gaze, showed up at my door more than once, trying to persuade me. You know, all the residents here contribute to maintaining the balance of the community. Wouldn't you like to be part of that? I already knew where this was going. I've seen these kinds of people for years in court. People who think they're little backyard oppressors, who think they can force others to comply just because no one has had the courage to challenge them. I always refused. And that's when it started to get personal. I was getting penalties from the homeowner association for rules that didn't even apply to me. My garbage was mysteriously not collected. Once I woke up to a tow truck taking my car out of the garage for unauthorized parking. There was always something trying to provoke me, to wear me down, to force me to surrender. But I never gave in. And then the fire came. It was an ordinary evening. I was at home unwinding after a long day in court when I smelled it. Burning smoke. I jumped up, and as soon as I reached the door, I saw the flames. My house was on fire. The shock only lasted a few seconds before instinct kicked in. I left immediately, calling the fire department while trying to comprehend what was happening. The fire was already spreading rapidly, consuming everything, demolishing years of my life in a matter of minutes. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. They managed to extinguish the fire, but my house was completely destroyed. And there on the sidewalk, witnessing it all, with her arms crossed, was her, the president of the homeowner association. There was no surprise on her face. There was no concern, no shock, just a cold, satisfied look. And it was there, in the midst of the smoke and ashes, that I realized what had happened. They were no longer playing dirty. They had crossed the boundary. What didn't they know? I was the most formidable judge in the state. And now, they were going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person. I stood there watching the firefighters finish their work. The smell of burning wood infiltrated everything. The place where I used to live, where I had invested time, money, and memories, was now just a pile of ashes and smoldering wreckage. But I didn't feel despair. I didn't feel sorrow. What I felt was a cold, calculated rage. The kind of anger that doesn't erupt. It only amplifies. And in the midst of all this, the woman from the homeowner association was watching me with her arms crossed. Her expression said it all. There was no pity, no shock. She knew. The police arrived soon after. The fire department, of course. A fire like this needed an investigation. I approached the policeman in charge, a man who seemed to have seen many catastrophes like this before. Everything indicates that the fire started on the side of the house, he said, flipping through a notepad. We're going to investigate whether it was deliberate fire. Did you notice anything strange before the fire? I looked directly at the woman from the homeowner association. She was still there, listening to everything. But when she saw my gaze, she turned her face away and began to walk away, pretending it wasn't about her. I have some suspicions, I replied calmly, and I'm sure you'll find enough proof to confirm them. The truth, I already knew it was intentional. The homeowner association had been pressuring me for months to join the association. They had already tried fake fines. They had already made my life difficult in every possible way. When they realized that none of this was working, they resorted to destruction. They burned down my house to frighten me. The problem? They chose the wrong victim. I knew exactly how to investigate a case like this. I'd spent years dealing with criminals who thought they could evade justice. I knew what the police would be looking for, what clues were needed, what legal gaps could be used against the homeowner association. And most importantly, I knew how to obliterate them. Over the next few days, I started to take action. Even without my house, I still had my car, my phone, and above all, my power. I went to the police station and asked for access to the preliminary report on the fire. The first analyses already indicated that the fire was not accidental. No electrical problems, no gas leaks. Someone had caused it. So I did my own investigation. I started by talking to neighbors. Some were neutral, but others were visibly uneasy when I asked if they had seen anything suspicious. Look, I don't want to pry, but I heard strange noises that night. One of them finally gave in, like footsteps, voices, as if someone was there right next to your house. I just nodded. That was enough to start with. Now needed the security recordings. Some houses in the neighborhood had cameras facing the street. I knew that if someone had approached my property that night, there would be a record. And I was. Right after a few conversations, a neighbor gave me images that confirmed everything. There, in the dead of night, 3 people walking towards my house, their faces covered, stealthy movements. And then seconds later, the flash of flames. The icing on the cake. One of the figures had an unmistakable detail. A shiny necklace reflecting the light from the street. A necklace I'd seen before. The homeowner association was up to its neck in it, but I needed to tie up the ends before going on the attack. I returned to the police station with the recordings and presented everything to the investigator in charge. I think this could be useful in the investigation. The man watched the video carefully. At the end, he let out a long sigh and looked at me. And do you have any idea who it might be? I crossed my arms and gave a humorless smile. I have a good suspicion. He nodded. From then on, the police began to treat the case as criminal arson with malicious intent. Now, it was only a matter of time. In the meantime, I needed to give the homeowner association a special gift. The woman didn't know it yet, but this was going to be the worst week of her life, and I was about to make sure of it. Over the next few days, the whole neighborhood seemed quieter. It wasn't the usual kind of silence, but one filled with tension, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen. The homeowner association must have already known that the police were investigating the fire as arson, but what they didn't know yet was that I already had all the pieces I needed to crush them. The first thing I did was call in some contacts. Being a federal judge wasn't just a nice title on paper. It meant I had access to a network of authorities who knew exactly how to deal with conceited criminals who think they'll never be caught. In just a few phone calls, I was able to accelerate the investigation into the homeowner association's money. I already knew that this woman loved to assert power over others, but now I wanted to know if, as well as being domineering, she was also corrupt. It didn't take long for anomalies to appear. Unrecorded expenses, fees that increased out of the blue without justification, and most interesting of all, suspicious transfers to a personal account, which, with a little more research, I discovered belonged to her husband. The woman who burned down my house to force me into the homeowner association was also embezzling from her own neighbors. But before going for the final attack, I wanted to see her reaction when she realized she was trapped. That afternoon, I went to the homeowner association headquarters. It was a small building within the community where the meetings took place, and where she and her associates signed their ridiculous rules. As soon as I entered, the murmur stopped. People looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. They knew that I had lost everything in that fire. They knew I wasn't there for a friendly chat. The woman was sitting behind a table, trying to look calm, but her fingers drummed nervously on the wooden top. She knew I had reason to be there, and she knew that if I was there, it was because something was about to happen. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to make some comment about how I was coping with the loss of my house. But before she could say anything, I placed an envelope on the table. She stared at it for a second before pulling it close and opening it. Inside were copies of suspicious transactions, records of missing money, and some of the evidence I already had about the fire. She flipped through the papers, her face growing paler with each passing page. I stood there watching the exact moment when pride turned to fear. She looked up at me and tried to regain her posture, but her voice came out weaker than I expected. What exactly do you want with this? I crossed my arms and gave a slight smile. Oh, I just wanted to give you the courtesy of seeing it before the police did. It was then that she knew there was no way out. The next day, the police knocked on her door, not just on suspicion of arson, but now also fraud and embezzlement. The homeowner association, which had once been feared by all the residents, was now collapsing. Some members began to drift away, trying to pretend that they never had anything to do with it. Others tried to blame the woman alone, as if they hadn't benefited from her scandals. But the damage had already been done. By the end of that week, the local newspapers were covering the story. The headline was something like, Homeowner Association President Investigated for Fraud and Possible Involvement in Arson. The whole neighborhood was watching her kingdom crumble. And the best part was that I didn't even have to lift a finger for it. I just laid the truth on the table and let the law do the rest. She tried to defend herself. She tried to play the victim. She tried to blame someone else. But no one wanted to listen. The very residents who had previously been afraid to contradict her now spoke openly about how she exploited everything, how she used homeowner association fees to benefit herself, how she made the association an instrument of control. Everything that had been hidden finally came to light. And then came the best part. The fire forensics confirmed that the fire started with an accelerant on the side of the house, exactly where the cameras showed those three hooded people. On the night of the incident, the police were already cracking down on those involved, and as I suspected, one of them couldn't take the pressure. A homeowner association employee, one of those followers who did everything the woman told him to, confessed everything in exchange for a deal. He said that he had received direct orders from the president to solve the problem with me. He told how they waited for the right moment to act, and how they believed that without a house, I would finally give in and join the homeowner association. They thought they were above the law, but they weren't above me. Now, with the confession and hard evidence, the case has been resolved. She was arrested, and the neighborhood was finally free of that oppression. The homeowner association, which had previously been an unquestioned entity, was disbanded. Residents were free from fees, absurd rules, and fear. Well, I stayed right where I was, because at the end of the day, they tried to ruin me. They tried to force me out. They tried to bend me, but all they managed to do was give me the perfect reason to eliminate them once and for all. In the days following the arrest of the homeowner association president, the neighborhood seemed like a different place. The fear that had previously kept the residents obedient simply disappeared. There were no more threatening letters, ridiculous notifications, or mandatory meetings about what kind of plant was allowed in the gardens. For the first time in years, people were free. Well, I wasn't finished yet. The police had already done their bit by prosecuting the woman, but I wanted to make sure she never had the chance to get back on her feet. The arson was enough to put her behind bars, but the financial fraud she ran within the homeowner association would be the final strike. With the investigation underway, the homeowner association's bank accounts were seized. The funds she stole were being traced, and residents were increasingly outraged to discover how much money she had swindled. I saw neighbors commenting on the street, furious, talking about how they paid absurd fees while she used that money to pay for expensive dinners and trips to lavish resorts. But the most gratifying detail came a few days later. One of the ex-members of the homeowner association, someone who used to walk with his head held high next to that woman, showed up on my doorstep. He was a middle-aged man, visibly uncomfortable, holding an envelope. "I wanted to give you this," he said, avoiding my gaze. I took the envelope and opened it. Inside were internal homeowner association documents, expense reports, decisions signed by the woman, concrete proof that she had been embezzling money for years. I looked up at him, waiting for an explanation. "I never agreed with everything she did," he continued, "but I was complicit. And now, I want to at least put it right." I knew he wasn't doing it out of a clear conscience. He was doing it because he could smell disaster approaching and wanted to jump ship before it sank for good. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that I now had the last proof I needed. The next day, I sent everything to the government investigators. With this new evidence, the case against the woman became even stronger. Now, in addition to arson, she would also be tried for fraud and theft. The news spread quickly. Local newspapers covered the case headlines, splashed her picture with words like corruption and organized crime at homeowner association. She, once the power figure of the community, was now the perfect example of how greed destroys everything. And then came the icing on the cake with the homeowner association officially terminated. Her house was put up for sale to cover part of the compensation to the residents. She lost everything. The same neighbors who once feared her now openly commented on her downfall. Some felt sorry, others just said that she got what she deserved. I just carried on because I knew that justice always comes in the end. My house was burned down. They tried to destroy me, but in the end, they were the only ones who ended up in ashes. And of course, don't forget to comment and leave your like to support more and more.